Laine Nooney. I'm your speaker for the next 30 minutes. I have been requested to make some announcements, including to please silence your phones or anything else you have on you that makes noise. And to remember to, as I understand it, evaluations are very important to this process. So whether you enjoy this, hate this, or feel merely lukewarm, please fill out your evaluations after this talk. So I'm Laine Nooney. I'm an assistant professor of digital media at the Georgia Institute of Technology. I'm a computer and video game historian. If you've heard of me before, it's probably because you know that I'm working on a book on the kind of cultural and industry history of Sierra Online, which has been kind of my primary research project for the past few years. It will get done one day, I promise. But I'm here to offer something a little different. I've been sort of circulating around in the game industry as a historian of this industry for some time, and it's kind of led me to compile some thoughts about how I think these two, in some ways, alternate professions can learn to speak better to one another if we get some foundation in what it is that kind of history involves and what it does. So, all right, I'm gonna go, okay. So I wanna begin by looking at some stuff that we've saved over time. So you may recognize this as the Bayeux Tapestry, an embroidered cloth 230 feet long, depicting the Norman invasion of England by William the Conqueror. It was constructed in the 11th century. It's made of wool and linen, and it's been with us for about 1,000 years. This is the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest deciphered writings of significant length in the world, enacted by the Babylonian king of that name. It dates back to 1750 BCE, and the code still exists today in the form of stone and clay tablets. This artifact has been with us for 3,500 years. Nope, come on, there we go. Sorry, gave it away. This is the Treaty of Waitangi, signed between Maori chiefs of New Zealand and the British Crown in 1841, declaring British rule over the islands. This has been with us for precisely 176 years. And then we have a 5 1/4 floppy disk, in the definitional sense, a standard data storage platform of the late 70s through the 1980s. The shelf life is 30 years, if you're lucky, 35 if you're Jason Scott, maybe. One laugh, all right, there we go. Thank you. So all of man's technological might, right? The end result of decades of effort in chemistry, physics, electronics, and magnetism got us a disk that any composition notebook could outlast. And if you're imagining here that the floppy disk was just a kind of brief stepping stone on the journey to informational ubiquity and freedom of access, where we can now live in this world where data is never farther away than the cloud, where we reside, kind of where our Google inbox archives will never be full, I would ask how many of you, if you walked out onto 4th Street and got hit by an Uber, how many of you could guarantee that your coworkers or your friends or your partner could make any sense of your desktop, right? Could parse your emails, could print out your Slack, right? What exactly is the historical status of your Kickstarter updates, right? Do you actually think you're going to be able to access Kickstarter in 150 years? So we can't even get past two-factor authentication if our phone's dead, right? So in this kind of world, what hope do you have for history? When any email you write will be harder to trace and more difficult to extract from the digital systems it lives in than what kings carved on a rock 4,000 years ago. So every year at GDC, there's efforts to honor history. There's barnstormer talks about the frantic need for preservation and the captivating efforts of folks like Jason Scott at the Internet Archive to save the history of games. There's postmortems on classic games, like the one that will be coming up on Oregon Trail, or kind of eager historical readings on some vintage game or another. This is how history tends to flow at GDC. And so it would have been very easy for me as a professional kind of computer and game historian to apply to these ranks to give a talk like this, right? And as I mentioned in the beginning, so if you have seen me speak in public before, this is what you know me for, right? My work on Sierra Online, on the 1980s and 90s adventure game publisher. But I'm not here today because I want to tell another story about Ken and Roberta Williams, King's Quest, or Mystery House. I'm here because I want to take this industry's Because if we want to take this industry's history seriously, as I know every person who bothered to show up at this panel probably does, right? I think we need to stop thinking that telling stories is enough, or saving our code is enough, or throwing up old documents on the internet is enough, which is to say that none of those are necessarily bad tactics. But I want to pivot this conversation, I think, because we could take this deeper. I think we've actually done a pretty okay job getting older stuff saved. Not great, but I'll file it under okay. But none of that seems to have done much to raise the bar for the history we consume. So much of it still exists in the realm of blog posts that are surely going to disappear off the internet one day, or kind of dazzling, forgettable books written by pop journalists looking to transform your nostalgia into cash. And after a while, we remember it all kind of winds up sounding alike, right? So much historical writing seems to rely on us responding to the past with awe rather than understanding. Or as I've put it in other venues, good history should make the present strange, not the past. And so what I want to talk about today is in the service of developing what I would call a historical literacy within the game industry. So not our ability to memorize a bunch of facts about game history or to fight about who invented the first video game as if that was ever an interesting conversation, but to address our kind of shared and mutual understanding of what history is, what it aims to do, and how we can be part of that process. So I've divided this talk into 4 brief parts. First is some groundwork to help us understand what historians do, how they think, and why they care about history for different reasons than industry professionals. Second is a call to expand our understanding of what constitutes history, so to think bigger about what the future needs. Third is to dispel the pernicious myth that the digital era solves preservation problems. And I'll close not necessarily with a takeaway, but something of a decree for what the industry at large, and possibly some of us writ small, could do to take action on the very real problems that face our historical efforts. Okay. So I would estimate that one of the greatest unexpected threats to the sustainability of historical research within games is the gap in values between individual industry practitioners like yourselves, who want to see your creative output and your unique culture preserved, and the professional historians who will do the work of writing histories based on such artifacts. So the pressure of this gap is actually kind of already foretold if you look at domains like film studies, where there's a kind of a divide at the educational level between people who teach history and critical inquiry and people who teach practice, right? They're kind of often kept apart. And so right now, game history is in this sort of in-between space, where most of the people associated with historical work are themselves first or second generation game designers, digital archivists, journalists, independent nonfiction authors. So we have folks like Frank Cifaldi, Harold Goldberg, Jason Scott, John Romero, Warren Spector, right? These are kind of the names that might come to mind if you're thinking about who knows about history, right? Very few of you, I can imagine, could name someone, perhaps besides me now, who is sustainably employed, right, just to do this work. But film was there once, as was the history of computing. In fact, all industries go through a phase where the first generation of historians are practitioners, and then come the professionals, quote unquote, right? This is something that has kind of happened historically, cyclically over the 20th century. And so this is what you get if you Google image search historian. Apparently, sometimes we are cartoons. We are mostly old white men reading books, apparently. Although I'm really pumped about the image of the woman on a laptop eating a giant cookie in the 3rd row. So I promise, despite what this wall of images might suggest, that there's nothing really to be scared of in a professional historian, so long as we understand one another's values. And what I mean by that is, if I were to ask anyone in this room, why do we care about history? There's a few answers I would anticipate from a room of industry professionals, educators, and journalists. So there's usually a big emphasis on wanting historical materials to help teach future generations. There's a desire to learn from past failure and success, to have access to inspiration, to protect legacies, and sometimes just that vague emotion that we call nostalgia. But historians have kind of distinct reasons for being interested in the history of games. So we sort of obey different masters, right? We have different professional agendas, and we take different positions relative to why history matters. So much of that has to do with the training and education of a historian, which may be 6 or 8 additional years beyond college, and the kind of work that is required of us to secure employment. So issues of legacy, valorization, and nostalgia don't motivate me. right? What does motivate me is the unique kinds of historical problems that exist within the history of games. And so like any professional, I am interested in the questions shaped by my profession. So while many of us might think that history is an end product, right, something that we consume or absorb, historians relate to history as a verb, right? This is something we do. It's a mechanic, right? It's one part science, one part art. It's a lot like game design, maybe, you know. Historians relate to history not as this sort of great chain of facts, but as a field open to possible interpretation. And so facts are actually the easy part once you've done history long enough. Interpretation is the hard part. Putting things into context, determining what is cause and effect, reading contradictory accounts and deciding, you know, what might be valid, right? And so this is what historians do, and this is what they love, right? History is a space of contesting ideas, not a platform for some objective idea of the past. So when we talk about why we save, or who we are saving for, bear in mind that person's foremost allegiance will likely not be to games, but to history. And the important takeaway here is to encourage patience, right, in understanding one another's values on all sides. The harder we push for expanding our historical stakes, the more these different values would really risk butting heads, I think, and cratering collaboration before it could even start. And so I think as if we start from a place of kind of awareness of why individual practitioners are drawn to this shared space, I think we can get a lot more done. So as anyone who has taught an undergrad class in game design probably knows, having students play old games surely teaches them that old games are different and strange, but it doesn't necessarily explain to them why they are different. And so games themselves are actually pretty silent on the tensions or forces that created them. And often, but when we talk about preserving video game history, often we're interested in the elements that kind of loom largest in the history of the industry or they're most captivating to fans, right? The games themselves, raw code, post-mortems, specific assets. And historians, however, to get back to this point of values, have a larger social, cultural, and economic audit. And so they're interested in a kind of documentation that I suspect many in the industry would probably find inconsequential or totally banal. And so to illustrate this dilemma, I'm going to offer you something that I tend to call the tale of two CEOs. So in Rochester, New York, at the Strong Museum of Play, one of the premier game preservation museums and archives in the world, there are two very different collections of documents I've been able to examine. And so first is the Ken and Roberta Williams collection, documenting the history of Sierra Online. And second is the Brderbund Collection. Brderbund put out Choplifter, Myst, print artists, right? A whole sort of, and that company was founded, and this collection donated by the company founder, Doug Carlston. And so as a pair, these two companies actually have are really good comparatively, right? They both begin in 1979. They start by making software for the Apple II. They both become titans of the early computer software world. They survive economic shakeouts. They produce some of the most iconic software for the home computer. And they both kind of become defunct around the same time in the early 2000s. But Ken Williams and Doug Carlston thought about their businesses and their histories differently, and that powerful distinction of personality is captured in their comparative archival collections. So the Ken and Roberta Williams collection is almost entirely comprised of front-of-the-house material and marketing items, so copies of their consumer magazine, publicity headshots, newspaper clippings, annual reports, press releases, and also a lot of personal mementos, so awards, gifts, framed fan letters. Ken Williams saved the nameplate from his door, which is very charming in some way. Very little of this collection, however, is design documentation, and there's almost no internal documentation of any sort. It is silent to the subject of how games were made at Sierra, so it's kind of an archive of a company's image, not of the company. And I would say that in contrast, Doug Carlston's Brderbund Collection is full of internal newsletters and memos, company profit and loss sheets, minutes of the board of directors, right? Revised org charts, stuff that I imagine you would just want to like throw away. Hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of paper explaining how a company like Brderbund actually functioned behind its curtain. So Doug saved copies of his first checks. He carefully annotated his profits. He sent company employees to industry conferences and had them type up notes on panels, and they attended, and then he would file them, and he saved them for 35 years, and then he donated them to the Strong. What Doug Carlston's meticulous, rich body of documents makes clear is something I've often found myself saying to industry workers, which is that the history of games is much larger than your games. And so this is disclosed within the Brderbund boxes and folders. This is corporate history, it's economic history, it's technological history, it's labor history, right? It gives us, better than any killer game or source code, a vision of what the world was like when the age of the personal computer dawned. And so sometimes I think of Ken Williams and Doug Carlston as sort of the Goofus and Gallant of game history, right? Who do you want to be, right? And I think we can use this comparison to think broadly about what documentation actually documents, right? You could think, who can't be seen in your documentation? Whose work isn't visible? Who's on your payroll who never makes it into your postmortem, right? A long time from now, reading those absences is actually what will tell historians more about your work and your culture than your games possibly will. And you should also keep in mind that historians are always going to write more about the guy who had the better documents. So for most of human civilization, we've been able to discern information about the past because materials that humans used for documentation, stone, clay, vellum, and paper, were robust in their own way. So certainly stone can crumble, ink can fade, paper can burn, but for the most part, if kept at stable conditions and not subject to catastrophe, such documents are accessible insofar as they don't require any kind of special technology to access, right? While many of these documents may be one of a kind, right, like the Bayeux Tapestry I mentioned at the start, and therefore not able to be seen by everyone, the flip side of this is that the basic barrier of entry to the artifact itself is non-existent, right? You could think a stack of papers or photographs you find in your grandparents' attic can be as easily examined today as they could have been 75 or 100 years ago. But if we begin to think that game history is bigger than our games, then we have to reckon with the phenomenal amount of material that we have made inaccessible to future generations because we've needed it to be ultra accessible in the present. So you can consider, for example, Steve Moretsky's phenomenal collection of Infocom documents, which is housed in digital form on the Internet Archive, and this is part of a larger collection of Moretsky's personal papers that are stored at Stanford. In each bundle of papers, we find a phenomenal range of documents: design notes, fan letters, correspondence from other businesses, internal memoranda, client pitches, hand-edited documents, financial information. It's a trove. What makes a digital document like this possible is that all of these things were once just pieces of paper, right, that could be shuffled into a folder, easily stored, scanned. But today, we use a different kind of proprietary software for nearly every type of communication we engage in, right? Formats have splintered, becoming email, Slack, text, tweets, right? Internal correspondence with clients is locked behind God knows how many barriers of software. Collaborative documents are stored piled deep in your Dropboxes and your Google Drives, often with no evidence of the changes and edits a document would have undergone. And so yes, theoretically, you can find somewhere in your inbox every exchange you ever had about your last project. But when the archivist actually comes knocking, what exactly are you going to hand over to them? And so the point here is not to stoke historical panic, although I can see that's maybe the downward slide where this is going, but to kind of push us to rethink the affordances and limitations of digital formats, right? And I haven't even kind of gotten to the problem of artifacts that are not easily understood in digital form, like three-dimensional objects, or materials that have like personally identifying or incriminating information that simply don't belong on the internet. And so let me be clear, this is not a critique necessarily of the Internet Archive or other online game history initiatives per se. It's more so a critique of how we've permitted ourselves to rely on the internet as an infrastructure, taking care of what is actually the responsibility of the industry. And so it is a critique of the presumption that the real historical work can be offloaded to anonymous, unpaid, or barely paid internet laborers. And it is a critique certainly of the idea that digital equals saved and that everything belongs in the internet just because it can be. Okay, so in 1984, several of the leading publishers of personal computer software banded together under the leadership of a man named Ken Wash and formed the Software Publishers Association. Founding members included company representatives from businesses no less prestigious as Brderbund, Infocom, and CBS Software. They were authorized by no organization. They granted self-rule by no institution. They were their own authorizing organization. They granted institutional rule unto themselves. Their aim was to protect their mutual interests as an industry, and chief among these, for them at the time, was the prevention of piracy. They colluded with Compute Magazine to publish a 2-page open letter to user group presidents and BBS sysops, articulating the exact threat unofficial distribution of software meant to their fledgling industry. And so as a historical document, this speaks to the efforts of entrepreneurs and businesses to identify what they understood as their industry's good, right? To make a case for its economic health and to establish the legal ramifications of copying. It is through such articulations that industries have become recognizable to themselves, right? And so I first learned about the SPA as a whisper, right, in a sheaf of documents tucked inside a folder of Doug Carlston's Brderbund Collection, which I mentioned just a bit earlier. So Carlston was one of the first industry leaders to sit on the SPA's board, and he had kept all of his correspondence with SPA President Ken Wash. And so letters from Wash reveal the SPA's remarkably lo-fi tactics, in which Wash himself would organize personal stings of software stores suspected of piracy. In exchange for not turning businesses over to the feds, Wash would demand a shakeout paid to the SPA, right? He was kind of like it was like the software mafia, kind of. And so what the SPA understood was that expecting each company to individually fight piracy was a duplication of effort and a squandering of resources. And so when representatives of the industry determined that they wanted to fix a problem, they self-organized. And I bring up the SPA as a way to frame questions of collective action and self-definition within the context of an industry. So whose job is history, right? Yours, but I mean that in two senses. So first, on the scale of the collective, an industry's approach to its history reflects its self-regard, and in fact, its vision of its future, not just its past. But in the abdication of taking on that profound responsibility, the vacuum will fill with whatever's at hand. What might an organized historical vision have offered the protestations of ethics in game journalism, as if the bonds between industry media and industry production hadn't always been cozy, as if the industry wasn't always, since its inception, a close-knit, extremely exclusive group of peers, as if a certain pliancy in relations between journalism and industry producers hadn't actually been one of the qualities that allowed the game industry to survive, to grow in the face of a dubious public. So whose job is history? When I first proposed this talk, I aspired to kind of rally you all behind the idea that somehow this was a problem we each as individuals could solve, that we could make some sort of game plan for a distributed archive. And while I do believe that the preservation and historicization of video games awaits everyone's contributions, I have mellowed in my faith that action here belongs at the effort of the individual. So in something of a turn from my original thinking, I've tried to consider sort of what video games could learn from older and more established industries. And I thought for guidance, video games, one of the defining media of the 21st century, might turn to the defining media of the 20th, which was film. And so the film industry has long understood that part of its heft comes from the drama of its past. But this is not a position driven by nostalgia alone. Historians of film have long been supported by an industry apparatus that not only values their work, but provides mechanisms to support it. So you need look no farther than the Academy Film Archive, the Academy Oral History Projects, the Margaret Herrick Library, all part of the historical arm of the International Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. The Academy was founded in 1927, roughly 30 years after the earliest commercialization of cinema. It was only 1 year later that the Academy founded its library, which has sustained for 90 years as the chief repository for materials related to this industry. So compared to the film industry, the game industry self-organized around its commercial interests faster, but it's more than 30 years behind in providing for its historical well-being. The game industry itself has no historical mandate, right? And that's kind of one of its problems. And so while the Academy of Motion Pictures may offer one of the most visible testaments to industry self-organization, there are comparable institutions, right? The History of Computing has the Association of Computing Machinery and the IEEE. Chemistry has the Chemical Heritage Foundation. Graphic design, the American Institute of Graphic Arts. There is no other serious professional industry on earth that expects its history to be crowdsourced. In some sense, our enthusiasm to be an industry open to disruption, to take on wholeheartedly the possibilities of digital distribution, crowdfunding, mobile gaming, long-tail economics, have not served us well in solving our industry's preservation and historical literacy problems. We have followed a model of displacing institutional agency in the same way we rely on distributed consumer networks. And so this will not work for history. So if we believe that this industry is here to stay, we have to punch up, I think, and sort of push on representatives of the game industry's organizing bodies and leading publishers to fund the organization of historical preservation. Which is not to say that we have nothing to do in the meantime. And if you want my low-res solution for the historical memory problem of our present, I would say put your crap in a box. So, which is like if I have, in every single instance in which I have been able to acquire historical documents from people who worked in the industry in the 80s and 90s, it is because they have some box somewhere in their house that they pull off and they just hand me, right? It actually exists in a physical form. They don't have to search for it. There's no combing through digital documents to find it. This is a sincere suggestion, right? You could buy a box and you could put stuff in it. So it's not glamorous and it's not heroic, but it's really damn effective. And you keep a box under your desk and you could put stuff in it, right? You could imagine this as a work process if this is something that you're into, right? So what's your thing, right? Kickstarter, teaching, budgets, art, design documents, game reviews, right? You could print it out and you could put it in a box. And it works for other digital stuff too. So you could gather up screenshots, web clippings, code dumps, storifies. My God, your photos, right? I would kill for your photos in 75 years when I'm dead. Like, organize them into folders, drop them on a USB drive or a hard drive, and put them in a box. And so the idea here is that saving does not have to be perfect, right? It just has to be enough. Documentation is never a one-to-one representation of your experience, right? It's a gesture. And so saving is like this act of trust that a future soul will be able to read that gesture. And the reason I tell you to put it in a box is because we need to get this stuff into formats that are accessible off the internet, that aren't trapped behind passwords, that don't require special software. And also, boxes are great for programs, name tags, swag, doodles, ticket stubs, autographs, your program from GDC, as well as awards. If you're not supposed to keep this stuff due to a company NDA, I would guess your company probably won't be around in 100 years anyway, so, I'm not worried about it. If you work at a company and would like to think about how, just to go through the thought experiment of like, how would you address this systemically? This is a conversation you could have, right, with someone at your company. Do you own a company? Maybe we could talk about this, right? We could figure out something to do. But remember that this is a tactic, not a solution. If we want, in the long run, something better than a box, and certainly better than a history we can't access, we might want to think about punching up. And what is the best industry organization to do this? Who do we need to talk to? I don't actually know, which is why I'm here, because I would like to think that we could all do this together. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Whew, all right. I don't. How are we on time? I have no idea what time it is.
You have a lot of time.
I have a lot of time?
Oh, yeah, it's almost 11:30.
Oh, 1 minute. Okay, we're gobs of time. Okay. Sure, yeah, please.
Oh, okay. I have a question specifically about preserving online experiences, things like server code, things like just even the experience of playing online with a bunch of other people. How might we go about preserving that, or what initiatives might be the best for preserving those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a real, so it's the Library of, I feel like Jeremy should get up here and answer this question. It's the Library of Congress's Preserving Virtual Worlds initiative has released several white papers trying to figure out this problem. I think the general consensus is we don't really know. And I'm not versed enough specifically in virtual worlds, although I could probably point you to some people who know more about that. I tend to be more kind of behind the back of the house, right? I'm trying to figure out who was doing the server updates, and that's the person I'm trying to get information from. This is one of the culture that exists in these worlds is is also a critical historical problem that right, I think many other media, right, are kind of struggling to figure out how to deal with, right? It's a point well taken.
Thank you.
That was one of the questions I wanted to ask and comment about, because the Internet Archive has started archiving completely runnable emulators for a lot of game architectures that you can't even buy anymore. So that might be an institution, because they're here and they have a big, beautiful church-like building that I've talked to them and other people have talked to them. And I didn't know about the Library of Congress, but maybe somewhere between the Library of Congress, which might move a bit slowly, and the archive, which is a bunch of hackers, we could get some first online worlds where the servers get donated and not turned off at the end.
Yeah.
But you already kind of addressed that. My other question is, so I've been engaged with other game developers, in this community, but you only see each other at GDC so often, and there's the GDC vault. But recently I started doing Twitch. Twitch deletes video on demand, like recordings of the developer's work, just by default, because you have to pay extra to keep it.
Yeah.
So I made a $100 donation to Memories of a Broken Dimension to the developer Exra, because he's like a shader sorcerer. I said, buy a hard drive, save the files. Stuff you're teaching and doing on your stream is historic. Could we do something like that to kind of institutionalize or fund the saving of people who do stream or record their work?
I'll address these questions in two parts. One, I think a lot of people, I would go on a limb and say that I'm decent buddies with Jason Scott, who is the kind of guy responsible for a lot of the video game preservation on the Internet Archive. And I think a lot of people aren't aware that that work is him and him alone, right? There is one madman in a top hat who is capable of doing this. And that is actually not, for me, a sustainable solution. I think that we have the man just had a heart attack. He's currently recovering. Whenever your preservation comes down to the phenomenal and I would say hugely in many ways uncompensated labor of an individual, that is not actually a solution, right? And so this is why I argue that. And I would similarly say to the Twitch problem, right? One of my arguments is that we have to get out of a crowdsourcing mentality, right? And figure out, or that that can work as a small-scale tactic in the immediate, but there has to be a larger conversation. And GDC seemed like the most appropriate place to take that question, right? Is that someone needs to be funding this, and it actually needs to not be us, right? It's kind of not our individual responsibility. I think that the industry could take a stronger role in this, right? In the way that we've seen with many other entertainment and technology industries.
Thanks.
Forgive me if you already addressed this. I walked into the panel late. What is your view? I know this is a very broad subject, but for preservation of work where the original holders, original creators no longer exist, entities have been dissolved, rights can't be determined, and oftentimes issues of great time importance because they're on hardware that's old and failing. I've done a lot of preservation of old and failing hardware myself, and there's this kind of legal versus moral quandary that you run into. What is your analysis on that?
What are my thoughts?
Yes.
I do tend to take I think I tend to be in agreement with Jason that you say first and ask permission later. That's, I'm not super susceptible to the legal quandary unless someone is actually able to enforce it, right? This is I think one of the reasons the game industry is equal parts entertainment and technology. Right? And so it has the technology part of it is the part that can't answer these questions, right? The tech industry is also terrible at this, right? They don't really have this sorted out either. And it's that component of, I think, games that has been slow to move on precisely these kinds of problems. Whereas I think institutions like film have adopted a somewhat mellower attitude about kind of, reproduction rights and these kinds of things.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure.
So I know we're out of time,
hey.
but so someone who's been around a long time and has been part of companies like Sierra and Interplay and Virgin, who, to your point, we didn't do a good job of historically keeping things. While I appreciate what you're saying and your note of coming here to try and do that, you're also in a room full of people saying crowdsource is not the solution. And I am friends with Safalti and others and have quite a collection myself, both from past companies and just games history. are the people who are actively trying to be historians, the Cefaldi, the Jasons, yourself, are you guys, who's the Mike Walsh of that that's trying to get you guys together to drive a deeper and bigger conversation?
I don't think there is one yet, which is what I wanted this. And so, yeah, I'm aware of like Frank literally just launched this 2 days ago, and I was like, this is an interesting counterpoint to some of the argument I want to make, is that we don't have one yet, right? And I would like to imagine a banding together, and I mean, Ken Walsh is an interesting story, and I don't know what motivated him to want to operate in that way. But yeah, I mean, that in some sense, like, that's what I'm saying, right? Is that if we could shift the way we think about this as a problem, we might start to come up with different solutions. And I think that is one of the possible solutions, right? Sure. Anybody else? Are we over time? I think we're... Sorry, man.